We are back with Michelle Deerwester-Dalrymple, who just read a sample from The Maiden of the Storm, which is book one in which series?
The Celtic Highland Maiden series.
Celtic Highland Maiden series. And one of the things that stood out to me, even as you were setting it up, is how it's obviously based on real history, and there are a lot of details in there. Like you told us about how they got up to Antony's Wall. The hero is a slave who is Roman. And, there were references in there to the roundhouse and gods and goddesses and all these little details. So, first of all, I'd love to know, how do you research such an ancient time when we don't have as many written records?
That's a really great question because I've had to rely on very weird references. So some of it was written by the Romans. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. Fortunately, archaeologists in Scotland have done some really great excavations of Iron Age and Bronze Age peoples. And so they're written records that I've been able to access. I won't lie, it's helpful that I'm a college professor because I have access to things that are a lot of times behind a paywall. So me being able to access those has helped a little bit with the research. And then so I just kind of piece it together with there's a good chance would have happened, what we know from the history of that point in general, like in Europe or in the world in a larger sense. And then I take things that were already kind of familiar. So there are some references to things like I don't know if they would have how they would have referred to their clothing. I don't know, I'm kind of piecing together the language that they think they would have spoken. I saw a really great BBC production on I think it's on YouTube. It's a 12 video series and it's about the ancient Celts and how the insular Celts of Scotland and how they differed from the continental Celts of Germania and the like. So, I was able to access a lot of that type of material, but it's really piecing it together with what's more common or understood or familiar, and then
Mhm.
just kind of trying to embed that ancient element into it. So it's not perfect. I'm not a historian, but I kind of try to do the best with what I have available to me.
Yeah. But then you also write multiple eras in historical romance. So, how do you keep track or stay on top of researching for all of the eras that interest you?
So a lot of notes, a lot of bookmarks. For my different book series, I'll have whole sheets of paper of the clothing they wear and where things are located and little maps. But I'm horribly organized. I will be the first to admit I'm severely ADHD. And so I struggle with some of that executive function for keeping things organized. I try the notebooks and the planners and all that good stuff. But at the end of the day, I just have giant sheets of paper tacked to my corkboard above for whatever book series I'm working on. I did finally get my act together. And on my most recent book series, it's actually published through Spiteful Books. It's not through my indie publishing house. It's called Highlander's Dawn. And I've finished book two that's in production. And then book three I'm finishing it right now. That series, we had to do a lot of medieval research and everything else. And I actually finally got a notebook and I made an omnibus of who the characters were and the places they've been and what we were focusing on. And that's helped quite a bit when I remember to get it out. So for the most part, just lots of post-it notes, lots of random pieces of paper tacked to the corkboard, lots of notes in notebooks, and then lots of bookmarked tabs on my computer.
Yeah. And are you drawn to different eras based on you're doing research or you're reading something and then you're like, oh, I want to write that story? Or do you intentionally go to these different eras?
That I don't really have a good answer for. I've always been entranced with the historical Highlander. When I first discovered the bodice rippers of the 1980s and early 90s, I kind of gravitated more towards the Highlander ones, but there were so many different random ones and the reason I started writing the ancient series is that I had had a good foothold on my flagship series with To Dance in the Glen that was my flagship book. And that was medieval Robert the Bruce, William Wallace, all that kind of stuff. So, but I had read a book when I was in college, and it was an ancient Roman in Britannia. They were in Londonium, so it was, definitely more of a southern, but I loved it. I loved it. He had to come to her aid at the end when she was going to be punished because she was enslaved. And it was oh, is he going to stay the Roman centurion and not come to her aid, or is he going to do the right thing? And I was enthralled with this book. I've never read another book like it. I read so many historical romances trying to find that vibe, but it stuck with me. I don't know the name of the book. I don't know the author. I can't tell you anything more to the book, but I started really seeking out ones that talked about the ancient Celtic tribes. And that is what got my interest in my Celtic Highland Maiden series. So that's kind of how I got the interest for that series. My other ones were just ones where I do have one that's in the late 1600s, and it's kind of gotten a little bit of an outlander flair due to the time period. It's the events that predate what leads up to the Battle at Culloden Moor. So that's kind of how that book, but that's actually based on someone I'm tangentially related to through marriage. Like that's the name Dalrymple plays a role in the book. Like one of the biggest villains in history for the Scottish people was a Dalrymple. And so because of that connection, that's what kind of, started getting where I was doing more research just into Scottish history and the name. And so that's kind of what all that worked together to figure out like what series I was going to write and how and what research I was doing. So it was more just the general interest in Scottish history. And then I just picked pieces and parts for what struck my fancy.
Oh, that's so interesting. My family does a lot of genealogy and they're always telling me like, write a story about our ancestors. And I'm like, I don't know if you really want me to do a romance about
Yeah,
our
it's
ancestors.
no the Lord John Dalrymple, the Earl Stair. He basically got that name. He got that title. He got those titles because he was the one who helped orchestrate the Glencoe massacre in 1692, which is basically like a Scottish version of a Trojan horse type of thing. So yeah, that's where that kind of came from. And because of that, and because of that history, I was like, I have to write a book series about this. But I didn't know where I was going to go or what I was going to do. In the course of my study of like research and trying to find stuff, I found out something about William, who came in, the Hanoverian king, who came in after King James abdicated the throne. And I found out something, a rumor about him, a good juicy rumor. And I'm like, oh, I have it. I have the story, and it's going to be based on a letter that. And so the first three books get you to the letter, and then I'm working on book four where you learn about what the letter is. So yeah, so in the course
Ooh,
of the research, I find like a nugget, and I'm like, ooh, okay, I'm putting that nugget to the side for later. So that's how a lot of this came to be. My nugget for my Maiden of the Storm and the Celtic Highland Maiden series, though, was that book that I had read like 20 years prior that just stuck with me.
yeah. Well, listeners, if you know what book she's talking about, let us know.
Let me know. So it came out in the late 80s, early 90s. I think the woman was wearing red on the cover. It's the Roman invasion of Britannia. There was Londonium, I think is Londonium is how you would have pronounced it. And at the end, she's been captured like as a spy and a slave, and he's got to decide if he's going to rescue her or not. So if you know it, please link it to me because I loved it and I can't find it.
Yeah.